disappear. And I'm not an expert, but going on Science magazine and an article that was published last year, I think it was, or the year before last, that idea that there was somehow a build-up of snow and ice in Antarctica against the trend has been largely refuted. So the estimate from a paper that was published last year in Science was that over the past 5 million years, the Western Antarctic ice sheet has disintegrated about 60 times. And it's always when we get to about 400 parts per million CO2. Now we're almost at that concentration.
But that doesn't necessarily link CO2 to the phenomenon.
What do you mean?
Well, just because we've had higher CO2 doesn't mean it's the cause of the
Well, I think
warming.
if you take the best atmospheric science on CO2 and what it does to the planet, right, this is again going back to the atmospheric physicists, they would say that if you have a 400 part per million concentration of CO2, you have a warmer planet. End of story.
Well, Lindzen would say that that's wrong.
Yeah, but Lindzen's
one of the most acclaimed atmospheric scientists in the world.
Why is he not publishing in the peer-reviewed literature?
He's published his last paper in the peer-reviewed.
I'd like to see it in Science and Nature. Where are those papers? These are the best journals in the world. This is the...
Well, there's been some question marks over peer review as well. The CRU leaks from Jones, so there's been some question marks over the peer review process as well.
I think you know that that's completely overblown. I think no process is perfect. As we said before, out of thousands of doctors, you'll find a few bad doctors. Out of 1,000 engineers, you'll find a few bad engineers. At the end of the day, though, when you look at those emails, you realise that scientists are human, right? They adhere to a fairly rigorous process, but they will, in private emails, will swear about the other side. Now, if they didn't, I'd worry, because that would be, very strange, that someone couldn't get frustrated and wouldn't write to a friend. The crime here, of course, is that those emails were stolen and put out of context.
We don't know they're stolen.
Well, they were.
We don't know whether they're stolen or leaked.
What do you mean? It ended up on a Russian hacker's site.
Well, we have no evidence, but anyway.
Well, at this point, I think it's a criminal act, no matter if it's illegal or not.
But going back to just the Oregon petition, for example, 31,000 scientists are opposed to the idea that human beings cause warming. 3,800 of those are qualified in atmospheric physics or geology. Their basic contention is that there is no evidence, historically or now, that shows that CO2 is responsible for the warming we observed. There's no way we can isolate CO2 as the causative agent.
All we have to ask is, why are those scientists not participating in the IPCC process?
A lot of them have participated.
Right, well, why haven't they been able to persuade all the other scientists?
What evidence do you rely on, as an IPCC scientist, that CO2 has caused the warming?
I'm an expert in coral reefs, and warming, and the impacts of that warming on reefs, right?
Right.
When I go to the question of the science behind climate change, I go to the IPCC consensus. That's where I go to.
Again, you're using the word consensus, but again, I would challenge you that consensus is not correct. There's thousands of scientists in the world who don't agree with the consensus.
Well, that's right. And I'm asking you, why aren't they joining in the process?
A lot of them are in the process.
That's right. And then why haven't they convinced the rest of the scientists, given the process?
They would say the IPCC is a political body with political ambitions.
So that's why the
fundamental disagreement they have is the assumptions that climate scientists involved in the IPCC make. The fundamental assumption is that CO2 has caused the warming we've observed. They state that there is no evidence that convincingly demonstrates that CO2 has caused the warming we've observed. If you look at ice cores, if you look at historical warming periods, and if you look at CO2 in relation to temperature over the last 150 years, there is no correlation.
That's not the consensus of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change,
which
is supported as a process by all of the academies around the planet. These are the best.
And again, Professor, they would challenge you that you can't appeal to authority. You have to show evidence that it's true.
Yeah, and I'd say if you look through the Working Group 1, all the evidence is there. It's there, and it's done very carefully. So they don't go, it's a fact. They say the balance of evidence suggests that humans are now driving up the global temperature through their production of greenhouse gases.
What's the single most convincing piece of evidence that rests on?
Well, I think it's not a single one. I don't think you go through this argument picking on that's the thing that proves it. It's a whole series of bits and pieces. It goes back to a fundamental understanding of the physics of the planet. It comes down to data from ice cores, tree rings, the whole lot.
The ice cores refute the idea that CO2 drives temperature.
Yeah, but that's irrelevant. Absolutely irrelevant.
How can it be irrelevant?
Well, it's irrelevant because it's not the fact that proves that CO2 is the warming gas. The fact is that the Milankovitch cycle, right, drives the temperature of the planet, and temperature and CO2 are both interlocked, right? So when you change...
800-year lag. There's an 800-year lag between temperature and CO2.
No, it's not that long. But anyway, the fact that you've got CO2 going up after you get the wobble in the planet is immaterial. The evidence comes from a whole series of other things, like pure physics, the warming potential of CO2.
Well, again, this would be the skeptic's main concern, is we don't have any numbers on what kind of warming CO2 produces in the atmosphere. We don't have any solid numbers on that.
I'm not an expert here, but I tell you, if you go to the Working Group 1 document, it will explain this to you. And you can go back through those papers and find the data trail for why we, at this point, think that CO2 produced by humans is a problem. Now, you can have your own opinion, but what you've got to do, if you really want to have an impact, is join that process and convince the other scientists that your science is better than theirs.
A lot of scientists have left that process simply because they don't like the political assumptions that are made.
And this is where you need to think about the framework. The framework at the moment, if you look at the IPCC, is extremely fair, extremely transparent and extremely objective.
But it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
That's right.
It's about governments. And governments appoint the scientists that go to the IPCC.
That's ridiculous. I mean, it's not about governments. It's about scientists that are...
Who appoints the scientists?
Do you know at the moment, right, the process by which you get selected to the IPCC, right, is that you put forward your CV and you have to be a published scientist in that area. Now, if you're not, if you're like several of the scientists that come up all the time talking about this, like Jay Lair or Christopher Monckton, and you haven't published in that, you don't become part of it.
Well, Monckton's not a scientist.
Well, that's right. Well, why is he then the spokesperson for that particular method?
Why is Al Gore the spokesperson for the other side?
Well, at this point, I heard an interview just the other day with Christopher Monckton telling me that the Coral Sea hadn't increased in temperature over the past 30 years, right? There he was, holding forth on it. When Alan Jones asked him, how did he know this? He said, I've got the data here. Now, if you go to the experts in this, the Bureau of Meteorology, right, you find that that's completely wrong. In fact, the graph is a nice steady march upwards. Now, what we have to do is we've got to go back to the science. We've got to take the opinion of the best scientists. We've got to have a transparent process to do that. And at this point, there is no alternative to the international process we have.
Professor Hoegh-Guldberg, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Well, thank you.